1st and 2nd Peter. Today we will begin with 2nd Peter chapter 2. The title is False Prophets. Let's look at the main points. First, the appearance of false prophets, verses 1 through 3. Second, judgment for false prophets, verses 4 through 11. Third, condition of false prophets, verses 12 through 19. Fourth, those who throw out the sacred command, verses 20 through 22. Verses 1 through 3, the appearance of false prophets. Read verse 1. But there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Here it says that there will be many false prophets. There were many false prophets in the Old Testament times. There are false prophets today, and there will be many more in the future. We believers must not be enticed by these false prophets, and we must not be harmed by them. Who are false prophets? They are those who falsely teach the Bible and lead believers away from real faith. False prophets falsely teach the Bible to believers. Let's discuss heresies. The word heresies come from the Greek word heresis, which means to choose. This indicates those who deny or distort even a portion of an important doctrine. For example, heretics deny the Trinity God, deny the incarnated Jesus, deny the redemption of the cross and resurrection of Jesus, and deny Jesus' ascension and return. They also deny heaven and hell. They deny the doctrine that one is saved by faith. They claim that there are other ways to salvation than through belief in Jesus. They deny the inerrancy of the Bible, deny the personality of the Bible, and falsely interpret the principles of the Bible. Let's look at the characteristics of heretics. First, they follow shameful ways. Verse 2. Many will follow their shameful ways and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. It says many will follow their shameful ways. Second, it says they act in their greed. Third, they will be in accordance with the work of Satan displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs and wonders, and in every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 9 says, the lawless. Heretics are perverse and corrupted. They do not participate in the spiritual movement, but take part in secularism. They deceive people with their greed. They are hypocritical and greedy. God will not protect them because they follow shameful ways. God let them be, and they fell to sin. It says that they are greedy. They lie in order to fill their greed. They deceive believers and extort their possessions. They seek profits for themselves. Some fall to heresies, and what type of people falls to heresies? Those who do not love the truth fall to heresies. Those who do not use the conscience of faith fall to heresies, and those under the wrath of God fall to heresies. We must not fall to heresies, and what must we do so that we do not fall to heresies? We must love the truth. We must use the conscience of faith, throw away greed, and give thanks in all circumstances. What happens when one falls to heresies? He obstructs the truth, receives God's judgment, and all who deceive and are deceived will perish. Judgment for false prophets, verses 4 through 11. False prophets will surely receive judgment. Here it gives us examples. First, God judged angels who sinned. Second, God judged the people of Noah's time who were filled with sin. Third, God judged the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These examples show us that God surely judges. Verse 4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment. Here it says that there were angels that sinned, and God did not spare them. God sent them to hell, into gloomy dungeons. The angel that sinned indicates the devil. The devil was originally an archangel. The angels also did not remain in their positions and places. They were arrogant and wanted to be like God. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 13 through 17. God sent them to hell and put them into gloomy dungeons. Greek terms for hell are Gehenna, Tartaros, and Hades. And the term for hell in this passage is Tartaros. Tartaros is a deep abyss, a place of complete darkness. This means that God put the angels that sinned into a place of complete darkness. Thus, the devil only works in spiritual darkness. the devil cannot enter into the spiritual light. Just as God did not spare angels that sinned, and just as he judged them and put them in eternal darkness, God will judge false prophets and their followers. It also says that the people of Noah's time were judged because they were filled with sin. Matthew chapter 24, verses 37 through 39. It tells us of the sins of Noah's time. The sins of Noah's time were the sins of eating and drinking, and marrying and giving in marriage. Yet Noah, who was a godly man, and 7 of his family members were saved. All who were ungodly received judgment. People of Noah's time received judgment by water, and in the end of the days, people will receive judgment by fire. Verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. It says that the people of Noah's time were judged by a flood. Verse 6. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Here it says that God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. What were the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah? They were the same sins as in the times of Noah. They ate and drank, were perverse, and lived debauched lives. They sinned, and fire came down from heaven, and they received judgment. They were made an example of what would happen to the ungodly. Lot, a righteous man, received salvation, and those who were debauched and lived in sin received judgment. Verse 8 says, the righteous man was tormented in his righteous soul. Verse 8, for that righteous man, living among them day after day, was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. Lot was tormented in his righteous soul by the sins he saw and heard at the time. We too must be tormented in our souls when we see the sins of this generation. What does it mean when it says that he was tormented in his righteous soul? It means that God will surely judge sins. Lot had compassion on the people who would receive God's judgment and perish. Lot was broken in heart. Lot hated sin and was tormented in his soul. Today, we too must think about God's judgment and show compassion to others. we must be broken in heart, and our souls must hate sin. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 13 says, "To fear the Lord is to hate evil." What is faith? Faith is to hate what God hates and to love what God loves. God hates sin. Therefore, we too must hate sin, and we must love what God loves. If God loves someone, we too must love that person. However, we do not have faith when we like what God hates, or when God loves what we hate. God protects the righteous in every generation. God judges the unrighteous. God saved Noah when he judged the people of Noah's time. God saved Lot when he judged Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 9. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue godly men from trials and to hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment while continuing their punishment. The Lord will rescue godly men from trials. God will hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment while continuing their punishment. Verse 10 refers to one with authority, which indicates God and the angels that God has authority over. It also indicates the church. It indicates political leaders. God will especially punish false prophets. Why will God especially punish false prophets? Verse 10. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desire of the sinful nature and despise authority. Bold and arrogant, these men are not afraid to slander celestial beings. False prophets are bold. They are stubborn. They are not afraid. They slander celestial beings. False prophets are bold. False prophets are bold in the way they attack God and act unrighteously. True prophets serve God with fear and trembling. False prophets are stubborn, but true prophets are gentle. False prophets are not afraid, but true prophets stand before God in trembling. True prophets tremble in fear that they might not be upright before God, tremble in fear that they might cover the glory of God, and tremble in fear that they might not fully carry out God's will. God pours out His grace on those who tremble. False prophets slander glorious beings. However, true prophets respect glorious beings. True prophets serve glorious beings. Celestial beings refer to true believers and the church. false prophets are not afraid to slander others. They will ultimately receive God's judgment. Verse 11. Yet even angels, although they are stronger and more powerful, do not bring slanderous accusations against such beings in the presence of the Lord. Here it says, yet even angels, although they are stronger and more powerful. And it also says, do not bring slanderous accusations against such beings. Who are these angels that are stronger and more powerful? Jude chapter 1 verse 9 says it refers to the archangel Michael. The archangel Michael has great glory and power. Michael obeyed God's commands well. When Michael obeyed God's command, he did not slander the devil, even though he could have. The devil interfered when God told the archangel Michael to move the body of Moses. When the devil interfered, Michael did not rebuke the devil. Michael only obeyed God's command to move the body of Moses. Why did Michael obey in this way? Michael obeyed to lift up the sovereignty of God and to remain in his position of a servant. We too must serve God in this way. We must lift up the sovereignty of God. Judgment is not in our hands. God is the one who judges. Even when the devil kept Michael from moving Moses' body, Michael did not rebuke the devil. Only God can rebuke. We must lift up the sovereignty of God. We must remain in our positions as servants. We must work as servants when we do God's work. Servants do as they are told. Servants work only for their master. Sometimes we say with our lips that we are God's servants, but we work for ourselves when we do God's work, and we do whatever we want to do. Anyone who does this has strayed from his position of a servant. He can no longer be used by God. At times, we do not believe in the sovereignty of God. We try to do everything ourselves. We judge others and jump to conclusions. When we do this, we do not lift up the sovereignty of God. We must not do whatever we want because we have power or simply because we can, but we must obey the sovereignty of God. God will receive glory when we do so. God also continuously uses such people. Michael had power and glory, but all glory went to God when he obeyed from his position of a servant. However, false prophets are the opposite. False prophets are arrogant, stubborn, and are not afraid to slander celestial beings. They will ultimately receive judgment. What do true believers do? They believe in the sovereignty of God, leave everything in God's hands, remain in their positions, and do God's work with humility. The devil was originally an angel, but he became the devil because he did not remain in his position. He became the devil because he was arrogant and tried to be like God. Today, each of us has positions. Faith is the act of remaining in our positions. For example, there is the position of a pastor and the position of an elder in the church. There is the position of a deacon and the position of a believer. Faith is the act of obeying in our positions. Anyone who leaves their positions strays from their faith. Arrogance is also the act of interfering and overstepping authority. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. We must always be humble and receive God's grace. Next, the condition of false prophets, verses 12 through 19. Verse 12. But these men blaspheme in matters they do not understand. They are like brute beasts, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed, and like beasts, they too will perish. Here it tells us the condition of false prophets. What does it say that false prophets are like? First, they are like brute beasts, creatures of instinct. Verse 12 says that they are like beasts, creatures of instinct. Jude chapter 1 verse 10 says they are like unreasoning animals and will be destroyed by things they do by instinct. Animals have instinct, but no ability to reason. For example, animals eat when they are hungry, and they take food to eat when they are hungry. In the same way, false prophets only eat and drink like animals. Second, it says they will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. Verse 13. They will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. Their idea of pleasure is to carouse in broad daylight. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their pleasures while they feast with you. Here it says they will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 13 says, "Evil men and impostors will go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived." False prophets will harm others, but they too will be harmed. To harm others means to do harm to others for one's own profit. Numbers chapter 31 verse 8 speaks of the prophet Balaam, and Balaam was killed when he walked down the path of unrighteousness. When people harm others, they deceive themselves, even if it appears as if they are profiting from it. This is because when people act unrighteously, they become unrighteous and they receive God's judgment. Next, the third condition of false prophets: they carouse in broad daylight. People work during the day and carouse at night. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 7, 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 6. We believers are people of the day. Thus, we must not get drunk or carouse. Anyone who enjoys carousing is dead in his spirit. They find pleasure in carousing in broad daylight. This also refers to hedonism. False prophets walk down the path of hedonism. They eat and drink like creatures of instinct and get drunk. They also make others sin as they do. Hence, both the deceiver and the deceived will perish. The fourth condition of false prophets: reveling in their pleasures while they feast with you. Reveling refers to enjoying feasts. Jude chapter 1 verse 12 says, "These men are blemishes at your love feasts, eating with you without the slightest qualm, shepherds who feed only themselves." The church must have relations with one another through spiritual love, and false prophets eat and drink and have physical relations with one another. The devil uses these physical relations as opportunities to deceive people. There are corrupted churches today that take offerings given in the Lord's church to use for carousing. This is wrong. Verse 13 says, "They are blots and blemishes." The fifth condition of false prophets: with eyes full of adultery. Verse 14. With eyes full of adultery, they never stop sinning. They seduce the unstable. They are experts in greed, an accursed brood. What does it mean to have eyes full of adultery? This means that they interpret the Bible in lewd ways. For example, let's look at the Unification Church. The Unification Church teaches giving birth to God's Son. The Cheonbukyo Church teaches the following. They teach the exchange of blood. Cult groups are perverse, and they interpret the Bible in lewd ways. However, true prophets interpret the Bible with spiritual meanings. Next, the sixth condition of false prophets. It says they are experts in greed. Verse 14 says they seduce souls. They are experts in greed. Heretics and false prophets want to fill their greed. They are experts in greed. Heretics deceive believers who do not have faith, and they steal from them. They use different tricks. Thus, those who fall to heresies usually have everything taken away from them. Hence, believers who do not stand firm in the truth are easily deceived and fooled. It is unfortunate because they will ultimately receive God's judgment and curses. Therefore, we must be careful of heretics. The seventh condition of false prophets, they are like springs without water. Verse 17. These men are springs without water and mists driven by a storm. Blackest darkness is reserved for them. There are springs, but there is no water. There is no water in the springs, and it deceives people, upsets them, and makes them even more thirsty. True prophets give water to people. John chapter 4, verse 14. There are many deceivers today. There are springs without water. For example, they say you can only receive salvation when you come to me. You can only receive grace when you come to me. You can be healed of your illness when you come to me. However, in actuality, they do not have salvation, grace, or the power of God, and they are like springs without water. The eighth condition of false prophets, they are like mists driven by a storm. They are not fixed. Verse 17. These men are springs without water and mists driven by a storm. Blackest darkness is reserved for them. Heretics briefly come and go like mist. They are also driven from place to place like mist. Next, the ninth condition of false prophets is that they speak empty and boastful words. Verse 18. For they speak empty, boastful words, and by appealing to the lustful desires of human nature, they entice people who are just escaping from those who live in error. Tenth, they promise freedom, but there is no freedom. Verse 19. They promise them freedom while they themselves are slaves of depravity. For a man is a slave to whatever has mastered him. We have looked at 10 conditions of false prophets. We must remember this, and we must not be deceived by false prophets. With this, we will conclude the 10th lecture on 1st and 2nd Peter. Thank you.